Actually, no. Number 5 is solidly at number 4. Or sorry.
Hey everybody, welcome back to Listography. Jason, Joe, and Krams are here. It is the 40th anniversary of the death of John Lennon, so we figured it'd be a good time to rank his albums, and he's got 8 studio albums. Technically, I guess he has 11 if you count the 3 more experimental records that he did early on. We are not counting those, but before, I know someone's going to be like, you have to count those. We're not saying they're bad or they're not worthy, but we are just sort of saying that they're apples and oranges. You can't really compare them. If you like experimental kind of like field recordings and that sort of thing, sure, check them out, but they're a different beast. So we're just going to do the 8 sort of standard studio albums.
Yeah, and it's a shot in the dark. If we did include them, I think they'd all be in our bottom 3, probably. This experience elevated John Lennon for me. I always liked him a lot, but I only knew a lot of his big songs, and pretty much, to be honest, only straight through the first 2. And I knew the 3 experimental albums. I listened to them in college. So just the first 2 and those 3, I was like, well, it's John Lennon. He's awesome. But, as the whole thing, 2 out of 5 being good. But yeah, all the ones after that first time listen for me this go around, pretty much enjoyed this. And my biggest discovery through this is that I really am starting to find that he's among my favorite singers of all time. I just love his voice, and I just love the way he sings, especially a lot of the heavier, like more rock and stuff he does, which is also evident in the Beatles stuff that I prefer him singing on. But yeah, very much enjoyed this.
I always kind of hated John Lennon growing up. Not hated him, but he was always my least favorite Beatle. And I think a lot of it had to do with the fact that I read a lot of Rolling Stone growing up, and they were just in love with him. And basically he was, perfect. And they always seemed to take shots at McCartney, which I resented, being a bass player and preferring his brand of pop granny music slightly. In the Beatles, I think they're, 1A and 1B. You can't really separate them. But solo stuff, I didn't really know his discography very well. I never really took the time to listen to it, but I liked it. I think it's probably the best solo Beatle discography. People like to say George Harrison because of All Things Must Pass, and maybe Jason prefers McCartney solo stuff. I don't know. Yeah, he probably does. But I think I like Lennon's probably the best from front to back.
Yep. I'm on Team Lennon, then George, then Paul. We know I don't like Paul very much, but that's not what this video is about.
I do like Paul, but it might be a situation like where in the Joni video, when we were ranking things and Kram was saying, even though I have these low, I still like them more than you. So I don't know, maybe it's a situation where I might like John Lennon even more than you guys, even though I prefer McCartney. Love all of his albums, with the exception of maybe one. And pretty familiar with all of them. I was actually planning on covering John Lennon before I went back to school and stopped making videos for a while. So I had actually listened to them all then and ranked them. And so this was just kind of a refresher for me. You guys ready to get into it? Who wants to start?
Well, since I like John Lennon the least, maybe I should start. I don't know if it's better to put the person who likes him the least or the person who likes him the best first.
We'll go you, me, Jason, so we just build to John Lennon fandom.
Okay. For me, at the bottom spot, number 8, I got Milk and Honey, and it really just comes down to the presence of one Yoko Ono. Kind of a big problem with both Double Fantasy and Milk and Honey because of her presence. Her songs aren't awful, but it just doesn't work for me. Her singing, you kind of have that jaunty rock, some of like the harder edge rock song. Then you have her come in, and it's very disconcerting to me. She doesn't have a good voice. She doesn't have good phrasing. Basically, nothing about her I like. I am a Yoko Ono hater. So this really comes into play in my rankings. But there are some good songs on in Milk and Honey. I think John Lennon was kind of starting a new kind of phase. He was sort of settled down now, the family guy, family man kind of. His songs weren't as hard edged, less political, more personal, and some good stuff on here. Borrowed Time's good. Nobody Told Me is kind of a classic Lennon. That's the single, I guess, from the album. It kind of starts sounding like Elton John a little bit, which is interesting because he performed with Elton John, and they did a couple songs together on Walls and Bridges. So he's got that piano style with the harder rock. So I like what he was doing here. If you take away Yoko Ono, this would be a very good album. But I just can't. Her presence just kills it for me, especially the John Yoko kind of. It just takes me out of the whole groove. So for that reason, I have Milk and Honey in the bottom spot. But the John songs are very good. It's merely Yoko Ono's presence that kills it for me.
I think that's pretty fair, but I wouldn't say that the Yoko stuff on those two albums kill it. I'd say it hurts it, but not kill it. My number 8 is going to be Sometime in New York City. I'm usually the last person to throw the P word out, but it's kind of a pretentious album. It is like desperately artistic wannabe. It has so much to say, but also is just so like lifeless. It's just void of meaning, and it almost fails at its objective. Like, it's not winning over anyone that's on the fence on these issues. It's kind of making a mockery of a lot of the issues that it's talking about. And as far as the music goes, it's not very tuneful. I don't really think that the ironic juxtaposition of like some of like the big horn sections and like big fun New York City 70s feel kind of suit it. It just kind of seems like they're in their own bubble on this one, him and Yoko. It's hard to kind of look through and see what's really you can enjoy from this album. It's the only one I don't really recommend. I think all the other 7 albums are good. New York City is probably the only song on here that I could extract and maybe put on a playlist or something. But yeah, I was pretty disappointed in this one, and was happy that when I read some reviews after I listened to it that they were also pretty abysmal. So I felt confident after that. So yeah, a clear number 8 for me is Sometime in New York City.
All right. My number 8, we all have a different record at the bottom, which is kind of interesting. Not surprised at all that Joe has some Yoko stuff at the bottom. Not surprised to hear that he's not a fan of Yoko, but we'll get to my thoughts on Yoko in a bit. At number 8, I have Rock and Roll, his album of covers of sort of early rock and roll classics, and I just don't think it's that good. I don't like any of the covers more than the originals, or even as much as the originals. I don't think he really captures the spirit of those songs very well. I don't like the production that much. It's just kind of meh. I mean, it's fine, but not one I'm going to put on very often. Probably the most redeeming track is Stand By Me, which has a pretty decent vocal performance on it. But other than that, I really don't like much from this record. So that's at the bottom for me.
Okay, it's at number 7 for me. And it could be at the bottom if Yoko wasn't, I mean, my dislike really kind of clouds probably my judgment. Rock and Roll is decent. It starts out good, I think, with Bebop and Stand By Me, and then it kind of just peters out a little bit. The songs are fine, I think. I like the production and the performances a little bit more than Jason, but they just don't add anything to the original. I don't really know what he was trying to do with this project. It's just sort of, I don't know, it's one of those little vanity products that you want to make an album of covers from the rock and roll classics you grew up on. Pretty much every artist that we cover has a covers album, and this one is somewhere in the middle probably. It's fine, but it's not one that I'm going to listen to ever again. So yeah, number 7, Rock and Roll.
Yeah, I got it at number 7 as well, but I like it. I think it's fun. It's simple. I mean, you guys said all there is to say, but I think it works as a quick, easy, accessible listen. A bunch of these I don't know the originals of, but I would agree that the ones that I do know aren't as good. Bebop is awesome. I like this version of Ain't That a Shame. I don't really dislike anything on here. It's just, it's not what you're looking to get out of a John Lennon album. You're taking away his voice. The best things about John Lennon are his voice, his spirit, and the things that he sings about, I think, is, topical writing and his kind of self-evaluation and therapeutic style of writing is always his strong suit, and it's nowhere here. But I think it sounds great, and I think his voice rocks on it, so I like it. But it's still number 7 for me.
All right. So we are kind of in the same ballpark. My number 7 is Sometime in New York City. It's a little bit more ramshackle feel to it than the first two. It's got a very kind of rough and tough sound. It kind of reflects New York City at the time. Artistically speaking, I think it's a very strong statement. It's probably his most overtly political album that he ever did. He dabbled in that sort of thing often, but this is really sort of in your face with the politics and the messaging. A clear break from like anything he would have been able to really do with the Beatles. I think this is sort of really him trying to kind of assert himself as an individual. And so I think there's a lot of positive things with this record. It just doesn't have the melodies that he normally has in his writing, and the songs just don't really stick with you that well. So, I mean, I don't know if I would go as far as Cram and say it's pretentious. It's just not super engaging, especially the second half. Yoko, for me, I think at times is very interesting and captivating. The live half of this record is not an instance of that, but I think on the first half of it, some of her stuff is pretty decent. So, if it was just the first half of the record that I was ranking, I mean, it would probably still be in the 7 spot, but I would think of it a little bit more highly. The second half does weigh it down a bit.
Yes, I have it at number 6. I kind of like the rough and tumble sound. Like you got the sax and the horns coming in, and it feels like New York City. And I think John would take sort of that New York City feel and use that in his next couple albums as well. It just feels kind of like a bar, not a bar band, but like a sort of seedy, rundown, sort of just a bunch of guys from New York City playing in a band. So I like that aspect. The lyrics, clearly he was going for a political bent. I don't know how well he succeeded in sort of, getting his message out there. Critics hated it. Everyone kind of thought it was a huge step back after Imagine. And I get that. It's tonally completely different. It's just a big shift in his worldview. Not his worldview, but in what he was presenting in his music. But I kind of, I trashed Yoko Ono before, but I actually think on this album is Yoko Ono's best stuff. And it's not quite as annoying to me to hear her with her own couple songs. I think New York City and Sunday Bloody Sunday are pretty good. But like Jason said, it doesn't have those melodies, those super catchy songs, that kind of pretty piano that he had started, it really used well on Imagine. So I can see why people kind of distanced themselves from this record after it came out. But I think it's better than the critics say, and I didn't think it was, I read the reviews first, and I was like, oh God, what am I getting into? And then I heard it, and I was like, this is kind of cool, it's different, it's interesting. So I was pleasantly surprised, and I think it's worth a listen. It's definitely worth a listen.
I am surprised by that take of that album by you, Joe.
Me too.
I would agree, though. I don't think it's quite as bad as some of the reviews that I read. I think it's bad, but I mean, maybe it was because it followed Imagine, but some people just wrecked this album like it was the end of his career. Like, does he even know what music is? But it's like, it's not that bad. We have listened to far worse albums in our listography ventures so far. All right, number 6. I feel the exact opposite about Yoko than Joe does, it seems like. I like her presence on Double Fantasy and Milk and Honey a lot more. So my number 6, I've got Milk and Honey. Kind of in the same boat, obviously, as Double Fantasy, leftover, unreleased tracks. It's put together surprisingly well for, 4 or 5 years after the time. It does feel like a sequel, but I do think some of the mix is a little different. It's a little bit sparklier and thinner at times, kind of more of like the 1984 range rather than the early 80s. You hear that right off the bat with the guitar and I'm Stepping Out, which is a really good song. I think the first half of this album is really good, and then the second half starts off really good as well with Borrowed Time, and it kind of goes downhill after that. I do agree with Joe. I think the trading tracks, Lennon-Ono, kind of, I get, like, I like the idea of it. And, they're so happy that the relationship's working again. And, like, they're this power couple. And you know, going through his discography in order, you're like happy for him by this time, but me that he's happy, you're happy that he's happy, but it's not it doesn't have nearly as many really good songs as Double Fantasy for me, so I've got it in the number 6 spot. But I think it sounds great. I think the production on all the albums sound really good, without a doubt. So, yeah, that's something that I will never complain on one of these albums.
I am right with you. I have Milk and Honey at number 6. I will disagree slightly about the production on this. I think the Yoko Ono tracks are a little too slick and 80s sounding. The reverb on the snare is getting too big. Always happens in the 80s. And the fact that John died before this came out, you got a lot of sort of unfinished songs. And so there's sort of this juxtaposition between his sort of less polished songs and her more polished songs that leave more of a divide and make it even like more of a disjointed record than Double Fantasy. Plus, I think it has fewer strong songs, especially from Yoko. So that's why it's at 8 or at 6 for me.
Yeah, we cover that topic a lot when artists get 80s out and buy into the contemporary sound of the 80s, and never bothers me. I love the reverb. Give me that high snare. Echo the hell out of my shit. Let's do it.
Alrighty. It's probably a controversial pick by me, but again, we're talking about Yoko Ono here, so it's Double Fantasy coming in number 5. And the John Lennon songs, they're all awesome. If it was just John Lennon songs, it'd probably be number 1 for me. Just like Starting Over, Cleanup Time, I'm Losing You, Beautiful Boy, Washing the Wheels, Woman, and Dear Yoko are all, you know, he's at the top of his game, I think. I think after a little, what critics thought was a fallow period for him, sort of when he and Yoko Ono split, and it had been 5 years or something. This was 1980. So it's been a while. He kind of was just hanging out, being a family man and doing whatever. But he comes back with a vengeance on this, probably his best poppy, a lot of piano driven. They're not ballads, but they're just so tuneful and melodic. They're all awesome. And then unfortunately you have all this Yoko Ono stuff just breaking up the flow every time. Every time you get into it, here comes Kiss, Kiss, Kiss and Give Me Something and Yes, I'm Your Angel, and it just totally wrecks it for me, which sucks because it's a great set of songs from John, but again, Yoko Ono's presence drags it down for me, and I just skip her songs, basically. I wouldn't listen to them. So for that reason, I had to chop this album, number 5.
All right, my number 5 is going to be one that I liked a lot and pretty close. Number 5 is solidly at number 5, definitely not surpassing number 4, but kind of 4, 3, and 2 are pretty close for me. But number 5, I've got Mind Games, which I like a good bit. I will say that I don't know if I've ever come across someone's discography where I feel like every album is so perfectly and aptly named. Like it just like is the most fitting example of what these albums are about. This one's about Mind Games. It's kind of his breakup album, you know, with Yoko. It's kind of how he feels about, you know, what's kind of the dynamic and the play between the two that they're having right now. This one is really interesting because he seems kind of lost on this album, but at the same time is kind of like confident in his rock and roll stardom and his artistry, where he's just kind of like, I know this is a rough time. This is the album I'm putting out. It might not be my best, but it'll get better. He's just got like this weird kind of confidence. And he's also coming back off Sometime New York City, which got terrible reviews. So starting to recycle a little bit of his sound. I love kind of the earlier first 2 albums. The way he writes and his chord progressions and his song construction are always kind of surprising and never go like an old conventional way. He's got just a really unique tact on how he designs his music. But on this one, you kind of start to hear a little bit of recycling. You get that also in some of the songs on Walls and Bridges. But there's definitely a lot of really good songs on here. The track is great. I love Bring On Lucy, Free to People, Out of the Blue, Only People. Meat City is an awesome closer. I love when he does heavier rock and stuff, and that one kicks ass for me. It's really hard and fragmented. But yeah, even on like Bring On the Lucy, it's the rhythm of his stanza is almost the same as Imagine, like the way it comes in and out and kind of moves. But I do think there's still a lot of really good stuff on here. The album, you know, starts off great, I think dips a little bit, but then gets kind of stronger and stronger as it goes on. So this was a really good listen. I just think there's 4 better. Number 5, Mind Games.
Right. Before we get to my number 5, I just wanted to make One more quick note about Milk and Honey that I forgot to mention. I really, really like the two songs near the end, Let Me Count the Ways and Grow Old With Me. They're really, really sweet songs to each other and really heartbreaking given the circumstances. And for me, like near the end of that record, that really kind of saves the record in a way for me. So love those tracks. My number 5 is going to be Walls and Bridges. This record's a little bit funkier. You've got What You Got and Whatever Gets You Through the Night. They're very groove-based tracks. Bless You has a very kind of R&B slow jam type of feel to it. The whole entire record has a very sort of unique 70s-ness to it, even though the majority of his solo catalog was from the 70s. This one specifically kind of sounds the way you think of that decade sounding. A lot of great tracks. Bless You, Number 9 Dream is great. Stealing Glass, Old Dirt Road, which he co-wrote with Harry Nilsson, is really good. I like a lot of it. I think it's a really, really strong record. But like Cram, I think the other 4 are better, even though for me it's a different 4.
Okie dokie. Well, we are going to have some differences, clearly. Looks like I'll probably be the odd man out as usual. Number 4 for me, and it's another one that critics love, but it just didn't click. I don't know why. Something about John Lennon just doesn't click for me like it should. For someone who loves the Beatles as much as I do. I don't know. I have Plastic Ono Band at 4. And this is right after he was doing the Primal Scream therapy stuff. And it just doesn't work for me. I hate to say it. Mother, I don't like it. I don't think Working Class Heroes very good. I think it's kind of, I don't know, Bob Dylan light. God, where he says there is no Beatles. That's cool. It's fine. I like the production style. I like the musical style. All the playing is great. The production, you can hear every instrument really clearly. It doesn't sound like early 70s stuff. It's completely kind of opposite of what George Harrison was doing and what the Beatles were doing, where everything was kind of lush and, orchestrated and kind of over the top. This is real kind of raw. And I don't know, maybe that's why I just don't like it. I like that lush orchestrated stuff. Not that I don't like this album. I like all of these albums, but it just doesn't, something that doesn't click. And I think it's just the lack of those super melodic piano sort of, not ballads, but pretty songs. There's not a lot of pretty stuff on this album. There's not, I like the Beatles. I like John Lennon's Beatles stuff the most when he's in his most psychedelic. And this is the opposite kind of that end of the spectrum. So I don't know, it doesn't click for me like it should, like all the critics do, like you two, obviously, since you're mocking me in the background. So I don't know, it just doesn't click. Still like it. Still, I know it's a great album. If I was rating it, completely unbiased from my own self, I would say it's a 5-star album because it's so different and unique, but just I don't want to listen to it that much. So that's why it's at number 4 for me.
Interesting point you brought up. Just kind of something we come across every now and then is just that lack of someone clicking, and it's kind of hard to put your finger on. Like for me, it's McCartney. For Jason, Jason said in the Springsteen video that he just found Springsteen to be really phony, which I don't see how that's even possible. But sometimes things just don't click, and you can't really back it up. So I get it. I didn't anticipate you liking this one as much. I definitely didn't think you'd have it at number 1. Number 4 for me is Double Fantasy. 4, 3, and 2, all really close for me. I knew 60-70% of this album just because there's so many really good songs on it. Pretty much, now that I look at the track list, I knew almost all of the Lennon songs because they're the better songs, like Joe said. He's right. Like I said before, they seem so happy on this. He knew 5 years ago that this moment would come, and it's finally here. It's really celebratory. The album's really nice and mature and parental, but also kind of has some of these moments of puppy love, and just like Jason said about Milk and Honey, just so sweet towards one another. It's just such a sweet, almost like Elton John-esque, as Joe said, kind of feel to it. I think the Yoko stuff isn't nearly as good. I don't think it's bad. I think it's decent. but it does bring it down a little bit. You know, Just Like Starting Over is amazing. I think her best song on this is Give Me Something. Pretty cool. But I mean, Watching the Wheels, Woman, Beautiful Boys, or Beautiful Boy, excuse me, is great. Yeah, I mean, pretty close to number 3 and pretty close to number 2, but obviously I think Yoko's stuff just doesn't quite live up to John's stuff here. But it's a really good album with a lot of great songs and definitely worth a listen. So number 4, Double Fantasy.
All right. I also have Double Fantasy at number 4. And I guess this is where I can defend Yoko a little. I don't think it's about really her stuff being worse than John's. I just don't think that their material comes together in a very cohesive way. But I do think her music on this record is pretty good. It's pretty interesting. I like a lot of her songs on here. Kiss, Kiss, Kiss is really cool. Every Man Has a Woman Who Loves Him is really good. I like Yes, I'm Your Angel a lot. And I think she's an interesting artist in her own right. I don't think she gets enough credit. I used to feel the way that Joe feels about her. Wasn't interested in her songs at all. But I think the more that I listened to a lot of more left of center stuff as I got older, my ears became a little more in tune to that sort of thing, and I appreciate her more now. I think she was pretty groundbreaking in a lot of ways, the stuff she did in the world of dance music and stuff. But like you guys said, John's songs on here are fantastic. I kind of wish the production wasn't quite so clean. It could use a little roughing up, but I think the songwriting is just fantastic. Just Like Starting Over, Watching the Wheels, all the songs that you guys named are all great. Dear Yoko is really great. Anytime he uses her name in a song title, it's a great song. It's something about the way that her name sounds when sung is just, it's nice.
I think you're terribly wrong about the production needing roughed up. The whole album is about them just feeling like they're walking on air, and it just should feel like this perfectly clean room that they have together in hotel heaven. Like, you're wrong.
Well, anyway, moving on to the top 3. Number 3, I got Mind Games. I keep forgetting to say when these albums came out. This is 1973. So this was after Sometime in New York City, and I think it's a nice bounce back. I think Kramzer put it nicely when he said he's kind of lost at this point. You know, he's without Yoko. He's without his muse, so to speak. So the lyrics and I think the overall direction of the album's pretty scattered. There's no kind of like theme here or like some kind of strain to bring it all together. But I think the music's all pretty darn good, starting with Mind Games, which is a lot, you know, it's lush. It's definitely that lush sound that I kind of prefer. But I think on the album, he still kind of brings over that little bit of that roughness from Sometime in New York City, the horns, that sort of New York-esque city sound. And I think he's on a couple of these songs, he sounds a little bit more like the Beatles, like I Sumasen, I'm Sorry. Little, you know, you can hear that kind of Beatles-esque, which was maybe missing from Sometime in New York City. So it's more of the style I like. The lyrics probably aren't as, you know, they don't jump out at you like they do on Plastic Ono Band. But I think the music is a little bit more my style. I liked it. I hadn't heard any of this other than Mind Games, I don't think, coming into it. But I think the first half's really strong. I like Out the Blue and Intuition. In the second half, Meat City's a cool closer. So a cool album. I dug it. I like the sound is what I like. I like the Beatles-esque kind of popping in, the old school 50s, 60s rock and roll, the horns. So this kind of nice groove, surprisingly like this more than I thought I would, or more than I expected to. Because again, the critics, I had no idea the critics sort of started turning on him as much as they did. I was reading the reviews, and Rolling Stone said this was his worst writing yet on this album, but I think it's pretty darn good. So I don't know. The critics were weird back in the 70s, man.
Yeah. And speaking of the 70s, at number 3, I've got what Jason, I think, properly said is his most 70s sounding album, Walls and Bridges. And because it's so 70s, I was very shocked Jason had it as low, but I'm not shocked that Joe's going to have it in his top 2. Because of that sound, and because, like Jason said, it's much more percussive, a lot more funky elements going on. It's not a funk album. But again, the only thing that's holding it away from the 2 or 1 spot is just not quite as many standout songs, because he is kind of recycling a little bit, not a ton. I mean, I know everyone has their tendencies and all that, but you can kind of almost in some songs kind of hear borrowed and rearranged parts, just kind of like re-put together at times. Just a little bit here and there. The exceptions to this are some great stuff, like Number 9, Dream. I love Steel and Glass. Nobody Loves You When You're Down and Out. Scared is awesome. Scared is really cool because it kind of brings him back to like the heart of his writing. Like that sort of song could have been on the first album, but he's still kind of lost, just like on Mind Games. But he's such a good artist and has such a good approach to himself and to his music that he just lets himself kind of run the gambit of emotion and evaluation on this. And you get just a lot of really good varietal songs, and there's still really good technique on here. I think when the technique was lost, like on Sometime in New York City, he realized that that's kind of his bread and butter. Is he's a great songwriter, a great song constructor. So that's what he's got to do. And he can let, whatever he wants to write about just flourish in that arena with that mechanism. A lot of his earlier stuff is all about him putting himself back through his own past and reliving it and all of that stuff. And then he got super political. And now he knows that he doesn't maybe have that much stuff to write about. And that's kind of what he does. He just goes all over the place. This was a really, really great listen for me. Obviously, I only knew the first 2 albums, so this was a really nice surprise. Loved a lot of songs on it. So yeah, strong number 3, Walls and Bridges.
All right, my number 3 is Mind Games. This is the first one that he did without any help from Phil Spector, the first one that he self-produced. He recorded this right at the very beginning of his separation from Yoko. And apparently he wrote all the songs in a week. So pretty quickly written. I think the sound in general is great. I think it's a really strong return to form after some time in New York City. I think the songwriting isn't quite on the same level as the first 2 solo records, but I think it's still really strong with a lot of great songs. Mind Games in particular is one of his all-time best. One Day at a Time is great, Out of the Blue. And just an interesting little thing to note, how much the guitar riff at the beginning of I Know sounds so much like Wah Wah from George Harrison. Very, very similar. But yeah, overall, I like this record a lot. I think it's really, really underrated. Maybe doesn't have quite as many tracks that would be familiar to casual fans on this one, but if it's one that you don't know, I would strongly recommend it. I think it's just ever so slightly weaker than Plastic Ono and Imagine.
Yeah, that was one I liked more than I figured after reading the critical reviews. I like the way, this track that sounds like Wah Wah, it has that sort of, not copying George Harrison, but there's definitely some familiarity in when you listen to that one, especially, I think, with some of the Beatles and Harrison solo work. I don't know if that was like a conscious decision on his part to sort of ape that sound or not, but
there is a familiarity to a lot of that record. Maybe that's what critics didn't like, is maybe they thought he was repeating himself, but it might be his most Beatles-esque record, which is why I like it. I think it's great.
Yes, that's a very good number 3. Number 2 for me, I have Walls and Bridges. Jason put it nicely when he said this is like the funkiest, boogie kind of, it's got that boogie beat, something like Whatever Gets You Through the Night was recorded with Elton John on backup, and he brings sort of his boogie flavor. And I think it's sort of all over this album. Really like Old Dirt Road. I think it's got a cool sort of out of the usual Lennon sound, very unique in his catalog. Number 9, Dreams, a cool pop song. Steel and Glass, I really like, sort of a continuation of How Do You Sleep. It's got that kind of jagged, venomous sound, which I like a lot. One of my favorite Beatles vocal performances from Lennon is I'm the Walrus. It's sort of that, not screamy, but like just dripping with venom and sort of just like anger almost. And I think he kind of comes close to that on Steel and Glass. And then, the rest of it's just a little more lively, I think. Again, it doesn't have that sort of connecting theme like Double Fantasy or Plastic Ono Band or Imagine. The songwriting is kind of all over the place a little bit, but I think he touches on many different styles very well, sort of rehashes what he's already done well, rehashes kind of what he's done with the Beatles, what he's done solo. And I think it's just a really listenable album, maybe not as pretty as Imagine or Double Fantasy, but I like that raw, rocking, boogie woogie sort of sound. Still got the horns and stuff from New York, so it's kind of like John Lennon in New York, really sort of lived in feel. So I really liked it. I'd heard a couple songs from this album, but I didn't know much of it. I think it's a really strong album, very underrated. I don't think I even knew it existed as far as the actual album title. I didn't think I knew there was an album called Walls and Bridges by John Lennon. So it just kind of gets lost in his discography, but I think it's great. So that's why it's number 2.
All right, my number 2 is going to be Plastic Ono Band. It's awesome. It's really raw. The songwriting and the singing is the star of the show. I think the songwriting is just as good on here as Imagine. Imagine just has a bit better vision. It's a little prettier and more melodic, which is why I will be talking about it after this. Joe said the song Working Class Hero was Dylan light. I would say it's Dylan-esque. I wouldn't say it's light because I think it is kind of Dylan-esque, but it's really good. It's just like Dylan to me at times. I love Joe, mentioned that it was that Primal Scream therapy kind of album. He puts himself in the shoes of himself as a child. All these unhashed psychological damages, he goes into first person gear, tackles them head on, audits himself psychologically. It's awesome. Not a bad song on here. Lyrics are absolutely tremendous. I would say one of the better lyrical albums of all time, and there's nothing too flashy about the lyrics on pretty much any of these songs. Really cool what he does on God, especially when he says, what he says about the Beatles. I Found Out is really rocking. And what Joe was just talking about with his voice when he gets that venomous, just high-pitched howl. The end of Mother, he's just this child throwing this desperate emotional tantrum. So good with his voice. Just the whole album is really good. So impressive and just really, really interesting above all else. It's taking a journey through his past, and it's awesome. I have no problems with this album at all. I just think my number 1's a little bit better sonically. So that's where I've got it.
All right. I'm a little surprised by that. I thought you would go with that at number 1. My number 2 is Imagine. I think you're right. Imagine is probably a little better sonically. I think the low end on it is a little tighter, a little fatter. It sounds really good. And like you said, Plastic Ono Band's very inward looking. I think Imagine is a little more outward, looking at the world as a whole a little bit more, even though there are still some very personal songs on it. It's really great. Songwriting is top-notch pretty much the whole way through. Not really any bad songs on it, but I think Plastic Ono Band is a really, really, really good record. But tons of great songs on Imagine. Of course, there's Imagine, Jealous Guy, Oh My Love, Crippled Inside is really cool. How Do You Sleep? Oh, Yoko. I mean, it's pretty close to a perfect record. For that not to be an artist's number 1 is pretty remarkable.
And 1971, I believe, the year that just keeps on giving.
Did either of you have Imagine in your top 5 for 71?
Nope. I don't even remember mentioning it. I mean, we just did Joni Mitchell last week, and I don't even remember mentioning Blue, and these all win in different years.
It's tough. The lack of John Lennon in our yearly list sort of made me feel like maybe the guys didn't like him that much, or I don't know. It's tough though. I get, like the commenters sometimes, I get transfixed on that top 5 when there's just so much more beneath it that you love, but you just don't hear it, so you kind of start to question. Okay, so yes, Imagine is my number 1, as you may have imagined. Other than, I think the title track has gotten some pushback in recent years. People seem to think it's overplayed and banal and whatever else. But pretentious. You hear that thrown out there a lot. But I think it's still a great song, even if the lyrics may be a little too utopian for some people. I think the melody on the piano playing on that song is, untouchable in its beauty, and sort of just that progression is just blows my mind every time. I could just listen to the music. I don't even need the lyrics, but it's just so pretty. And you have, I definitely see why people like Plastic Ono Band the best, because it has that current that runs through it of just sort of that psychological bent that Ramser was talking about. But for me, Imagine is just so pretty. I think I Don't Want to Be a Soldier, Mom, I Don't Want to Die is a better sort of social commentary than Working Class Hero. I think it's a little sharper. As much as I love Paul McCartney, How Do You Sleep is such a good diss track. It's just phenomenal. The venom and the sort of, not hatred, but just his lyrics. It's like all encompassing meanness, and like the song itself sounds like it's an attack, even without the lyrics. It sounds like it's, attack, some kind of affront on someone. And the lyrics just are so good, so kind of mean and well thought out. It's not just random, mumbling and jumbling like I'm doing. It's well thought out. It's very stark and cruel, and I like that. I like that kind of side of him. Even though I love McCartney and I prefer McCartney, but I think he sort of won the war of diss tracks as far as when they're solo artists. And I think Oh Yoko is probably my favorite song about Yoko Ono. I think it's really pretty and cute. So I think this album's just, again, we didn't mention it in 1971, but it's pretty much perfect all the way through. There's no sort of weird asides or sort of, on Plastic Ono, there's a couple tracks where it's kind of takes you out of the flow a little bit for me, because it concentrates a little bit too much on the lyrics and sort of the feeling of it. This is just pure songwriting all the way through, and it's just great. Brilliant album. Easy number one for me.
I also think it is an easy number one. I got a lot to say. You said everything great, but yeah, how Plastic Ono kind of has that undercurrent, that cohesive undercurrent. This one kind of reminds me of Bridge Over Troubled Water a little bit. How it's just like 10 really masterfully flushed out songs where you treat every individual song in the studio like it's its own album and it has its own feel to it. And then it's just kind of like a highlight reel of his talents. I mean, there's more cohesiveness to it than I think Bridge Over Troubled Water, but that's kind of how I see this album. It's just kind of like this all-star performance of him and so many different things. To touch on what you said about criticism for Imagine, how some people think it's cheesy and utopian. Well, the song's not called Reality, it's called Imagine. Use your imagination. I mean, how stupid and dim can you be about it? I mean, you're really reaching for criticisms if you ignore the defense against you in the title of the album and the song. All right, that aside, every song in here is just killer. His voice is great all over it. I think the production, like Jason said, has just a little nicer, rounded edge to it. Plastic Ono is really raw and sharp, piercing at times. This one is warm. And Jason said it great. The first one's so inward looking, like it's him diving into finding himself. Boom, he finds himself, and now he wants to give back. This is like his gift to the world, is like this album. I think it's great. Looking at what I have for 71, obviously this one I'm on a high on Imagine right now, but still, like, it's not going to get into 1971, maybe even the top 10. It's ridiculous for 71, but I do think this is clearly his best album, although I love Plastic Ono, and I really liked Walls and Bridges a lot, but I think this one just stands out because it's just that lightning in a bottle term we use a lot, where everything comes together, the lyrics, the performances, the sound. It's the best. Number one.
All right. For me, number one, you already know what it is. Plastic Ono Band. Probably the best album not to make a top 5 for me. Will probably remain that way through the rest of the Albums of the Year series. Just a really, really good album. It was tough to leave off. There's so many good records in the early 70s. Imagine's up there is another one that's really one of the better ones not to make a list. But this whole album is just like a catharsis for him, I feel like. And when you're listening to it, it's almost like you're sitting in on a therapy session for him or something. It's just one of the most direct expressions from like artists, from their thought to the pen to the performance, that you'll ever hear. There's no really like overthinking or filtering. It's just, this was the thought, and the thought came out exactly the way it was. And it's really, really impressive and difficult to do as an artist. To not get in the way of yourself is extremely difficult, and I think this is one of the best examples of not doing that. And I love the production on it, aside from all the lyrical things that we've talked about. Some of my favorite sounding drums ever on this record. This style of recording is my favorite sound of recording. I love the sort of deadened drums with the tight sort of slap delay on them. I think that's a awesome sound, and there's slap delay all over this record on his vocals and everything, and it's just really, really cool. I love the sound of it. And yeah, for me, as good as Imagine is, I just think that this is one of the most definitive artistic statements by anybody ever. And it wasn't in the top 5 in 1970.
Left out by a fellow Beatle, probably.
All Things Must Pass that on, right?
Yeah, which a catharsis of its own way, because it's, you know, all these songs that he had built up coming out, and John Lennon had all this trauma and, you know, bad childhood and everything else coming out. So it's interesting, the parallels between them.
What else is interesting is that your reasoning for loving this album and its direct brain, heart, pen, paper, record, you didn't feel that way about Joni Mitchell last week. That sort of style of hers wasn't your favorite part of her discography, when she was just more literal and direct and vulnerable. But that's why we do this. It's cool. We're figuring you out. We're getting into your primal scream therapy by figuring out which artists you like and all that.
Yeah, I don't know why. I mean, I think it has more to do with the voice and just the delivery of the lyrics more than anything. I think John is incredible, and Joni, I mean, for her fans, she's incredible too. She's just not my favorite singer in the world, so I prefer her more elaborate musical explorations.
It's interesting because Lennon has, you know, that sort of psychologicalness, the catharsis that Jason's talking about, and Joni's more of like stream of consciousness, sort of everything, whereas Lennon, you know, it's not the same kind of way of being personal at all. It's almost opposite, the way Joni and John kind of express their innermost thoughts and feelings in music. And it's very different, yet, you know, it's 1 year apart. It's kind of the same time frame, same decade. So it's interesting, the dichotomy between them.
Yeah, it's like John knows what his issues are, and he's like, all right, this is how I'm going to figure this out. And Joni's just like, how am I feeling? Well, let's find out. Let's grab a guitar. And if you just fast forward to this part of the video, we don't think Joni Mitchell and John Lennon are comparable and that they sound alike. Like I said, my biggest takeaway from this is he is probably in my top 25 singers now. Like, just getting a big, healthy dose of them. Love his voice. And I love, you know, I think a lot of that is the way it's done in the studio, but he's just has such a cool sound to his voice and is a great singer. I love it. Personal favorite of mine.
All right, so everybody can let us know how you rank them down below, what you think of our lists. Make sure you hit the like button, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, hit the bell for notifications, and look down in the description for links to our social media accounts. If you're not subscribed, if you're new and just stumbling upon this video, we put out a lot of content. We do pretty much at least 4 videos a week, sometimes more. So if you enjoyed this video, you know, hit that subscribe button. It's worth it, we think. So we'll see you in the next video. Thanks for watching, everybody.